Well, welcome everybody. My name is John Maynard. I'm the Director of Programs here at the Newseum. Welcome to the Night TV studio and this edition of Inside Media. This is actually also a podcast that'll pop up on our website, and you can get that on iTunes starting next week. We all hope you had a chance to see our Reporting Vietnam exhibit, which is up on the 6th floor. It explores the dramatic stories of how journalists brought news about the war to a divided nation. The exhibit really challenges perceptions that linger 50 years after U.S. troops arrived in Vietnam and poses the question, did the press lose the war? Over the course of the exhibit, the Newseum has been fortunate to host several journalists who covered the war from both print and television. We also featured an all-women journalist panel who talked about the challenges they faced covering the war. So today we're going to shift gears a bit with a discussion about the new book, The 5 O'Clock Follies. What's a woman doing here anyway? This is a fact-based novel about a woman journalist covering the war. It's actually a historically accurate and thoroughly entertaining account of the war as seen through the eyes of fictional reporter Angela Martinelli. We are so pleased today to be joined by the author of The 5 O'Clock Follies, Theasa Tuohy. Theasa is a veteran journalist whose career included assignments with the Associated Press, the Detroit News, the Detroit Free Press, Newsday, the Star-Ledger, and the Gannett Herald-Statesman. At the Detroit News, she became the first woman assistant city editor in that newspaper's history. And she also is the co-book author of Scandalous, the musical, an awarded show about the life of writer D.H. Lawrence. So please welcome Theasa Tuohy. Welcome, Theasa. So first I want to talk about the title of the book, because it's referenced in our exhibit also. Tell us, what are the 5 O'Clock Follies?
Well, the government gave a press briefing every day in Saigon at 5 o'clock. Right. And the journalists called it the Follies because they felt like there wasn't always only brief interludes of candor, as one of my characters says.
Right.
A slight funny anecdote about that is, at a book signing, a guy that I knew from Newsday, a reporter, had been a PIO, a press information officer in Saigon, and he said they got so upset with being called the 5 O'Clock Follies that they changed the time of the meeting to 5:30.
Okay. Wow.
Which I thought was like
the 5:30 Follies now.
Just,
right,
well,
right, yeah.
They thought this would stop people from the pejorative term that they were using.
Right, which did become very famous. So tell us what kind of inspired you to write this book about journalists, and particularly a female journalist, covering the Vietnam War. How did the idea come to you?
People ask me that question, and who knows? I mean, it was a long journey. I had initially, when I was working in Detroit, I think, I was married to a film critic, or a film and theater critic, so I thought he would help me write plays or something.
Okay,
so
right.
I started out with a story about a combat photographer, a woman combat photographer, and her name was Angela Martinelli.
Oh, there you go.
Where that name came from, I will never know.
Right.
But anyway, that's where the name came from, and the genesis of the character.
Right.
I'd already worked for 3 papers at that point, and in the 60s, there weren't a lot of women journalists around, and they had a little bit of a tough time, not too tough, but anyway.
Tell us a little bit about Angela Martinelli, the lead character. She's a hard-drinking, hard-charging reporter, but she comes from this privileged background, which you reference in the book.
Right.
Why did she decide to go to Vietnam to cover a war?
Well, she'd gone through one serious boyfriend in San Francisco who had been supportive of her. He was a jazz musician. And she finally defied her very privileged family and background and went to journalism school at Northwestern. and got a job working only because one of her professors forced the city editor to take her on. And she, just like everybody else, wanted to go to Vietnam. That's where the story was. That's where the big story was. But women couldn't even get jobs doing anything other than mostly working on women's pages. So she saved her money and bought a plane ticket to Saigon and decided to freelance. The thing that saved her, otherwise she would have starved to death, because nobody was wanting to buy her stuff, and how, it was really tough to freelance at that point. But the Tet Offensive came along.
Right. And this is 1968 is when this starts.
She arrived in Saigon in late 1967.
Right.
And just, made friends with a couple. There was one guy from Chicago who had been behind her in journalism school at Northwestern. And he goes through the whole book sort of having a crush on her that he didn't really recognize. So he was her supporter. And so she became friends with a few of the guys that he hung out with. They finally sort of started accepting her. And then when Tet broke out, Nick, the male character, Nick O'Brien, that is really her basic supporter, he was working for a Chicago paper, and so he was trying to figure out how he could file and cover the embassy, the attack on the embassy at the same time. Because the filing situation was such that the embassy was not too far from where it was the Reuters office that would allow other people to file, but he knew there was going to be a long list trying to file at the Reuters office. So he's just standing there. None of them could do anything. They were all outside because nobody could get inside. The sappers had the embassy totally held down until some Marines came in a helicopter and finally got in. But Nick is really worried. What's he going to do? How is he going to see what happens and know when, suddenly something's going to break and he's not going to be able to file it? At the same time, he's got to let his office in Chicago know that he's on the job. Here comes Angela walking up the street.
And he helps her.
And so this was the thing that really made her career and allowed her to stay, because then the Chicago Tribune would allow her to at least freelance for them.
I'm glad you mentioned freelance, because in doing your research for this book, tell us the difference between what a freelance reporter was doing in Vietnam as opposed to the reporters there that were with established newspapers. They had it much tougher, obviously. And
first of all, most of the papers or wire services would not send a woman. So any woman that was going to go had to go as a freelancer.
Right.
But the thing that was totally weird about the Vietnam situation that probably never really happened before or since was people just went.
Right.
Somebody that decided they wanted to go to Vietnam could go to their church newsletter and get a letter saying that they were going to cover the war, and they'd go buy their own ticket and go, and they'd go to MACPA and say, here's my credential, and they'd give them credentials.
Right.
It wasn't a war. It was a never, ever declared war. So the government had not set up the kind of thing that they set up during World War II, or that they've had in wars since, where you had to be in what do they call it?
Embedded.
Embed.
Yeah.
Embedded.
Embeds, yeah.
Yeah. So that's one of the things that made Vietnam so different and yet so fascinating, that the reporters just kind of wandered around and pretty much did what they wanted. Right. From time to time, Johnson and Westmoreland would think about some way to to stop these reporters from running out and writing stuff that the government was saying wasn't happening.
Right, right, right.
Anyway, that was, Angela had to be a freelancer.
Right.
And I think initially any woman that went there was a freelancer.
Right.
Even you were mentioning that woman from Honolulu.
Right, Denby Fawcett.
Right,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
I think she went initially, she followed a boyfriend over there.
right.
She'd been working for the Honolulu Advertiser.
Right.
They, again, would not send her, so she bought her own ticket and followed her boyfriend over, and then finally,
Right.
since she'd worked for the Advertiser anyway, then they started picking up her stuff.
Sticking on women journalists, how did did the war have an impact on the role of female journalists moving forward, in the future, following the Vietnam War?
You know, people like to say that it finally did. I mean, certainly the accepted wisdom is that Edie Lederer was the first. She was the first one assigned by the AP.
Right.
But there's a funny story even attached to that. Richard Pyle, the Saigon bureau chief, apparently decided he wanted a woman and asked for a woman. And Edie, again, talk about paying your own way. Edie was working for the AP in San Francisco, and when she had a vacation coming up, she decided to take a round-the-world trip, and guess where she went?
Right, Vietnam.
She went to Saigon.
Right.
She saw Dick Pyle. He took her around, showed her around, and decided, this is the person I want. Wes Gallagher, who was the president of the AP at that time, and was so against women going into any combat whatsoever, when the AP sent a woman over during the World War II to cover women's stuff, to cover the WACs and cover the nurses, Wes Gallagher was the bureau chief in North Africa at the time, and he wouldn't let her come in the office. He wouldn't let her file.
Wow.
He's like, get her out of here. Wow. I don't know how he got away with that since New York had sent her.
Right.
But
Right.
anyway, Wes Gallagher was the guy that assigned Edie, but only after Richard Pyle asked for her, number one, and number two, Wes Gallagher said to Edie, you're not going into combat, which of course turned out, I mean, Edie was
She was right there.
a little
Right.
holy terror.
Yep. I was wondering, I mentioned in the opening your long career as a reporter, editor. Did you use a lot of your personal experiences? Did that guide you in writing this book?
Well, yeah. I mean, I knew what it felt like for the guys to not want to talk to you, which was what initially happened to Angela when she first walked in and tried to sit at the bar of the Continental. They'd all move away and leave a blank bar stool on each side of her. At the Newark Star-Ledger, I was first woman on the copy desk there, and I went through a spell where no one on the copy desk would talk to me except the slot guy who had to talk to me to give me a head order or a word count on a story.
Right. There's two other major characters that you mentioned, Nick O'Brien and Curtis Ford. Are these based on real life journalists who covered the war? Were you basing them?
No,
on
you know,
composites,
somebody
or?
was asking me that today.
Yeah.
The patrician part of Curtis Ford was my idea of Ben Bradley from the Washington Post. But otherwise, I think he was sort of a setup to be from the same upper class background that she was from and that she was trying to get away from. Nick, I don't know, people that read early versions of the book thought that I was both Angela, that Angela and Nick were both me, that they were just parts of my own character. Bo Parks, the crazy photographer.
Yep.
Totally based on Tim Page.
Okay. Tell us a little about Tim Page, what you know about Tim Page for audience members who might not know.
Tim Page, you floored me when the picture you're using for the main picture for the exhibit, Tim Page is one of the three guys that you see in that
signature image.
In that wonderful photo that you've used to advertise the thing.
Right.
Tim Page was really nuts. He was like just, and almost everything in the book about Beau Parks, he was called Tim Page in the book until a lawyer told me you can't do that. The stuff that he did, he actually was a London street kid who went to Vietnam on his motorcycle. Mm-hmm. And he was injured in combat badly, at least 3 times. He was a really good friend of Sean Flynn, and also of, I'm awful remembering names anymore.
That's okay.
Dispatches, Michael Hare. Michael Hare, and the Flynn, Sean Flynn, were big buddies. Michael Hare that's where I first picked up on Tim Page, was in Michael Hare's Dispatches, which is a fantastic book. He was writing for who? Esquire, was it? Sure. I think it was Esquire. He did, like really long pieces and wasn't doing any kind of spot news. Right. And his Dispatches is just, absolutely magnificent. And it's I think an awful lot of collection of these long magazine pieces that he was doing. Sean Flynn, Earl Flynn's son, was just disappeared in Cambodia. I think this was after the Vietnam War. I mean, these guys were just people that, they were sort of war lovers. Right. And Angela and Nick have a conversation in the book, worrying finally that maybe are they war lovers? I mean, why are they sort of so turned on? It's a very interesting philosophical question about why people do this in the first place, why they want to cover war. And a lot of them, and I think this again comes probably from Michael Hare, I forget anymore where a lot of the research comes from, but a lot of them they just feel like they become junkies, the adrenaline.
They have to do it,
yeah.
There's a lot of history of the war in this book, but there's also some romance and certainly some humor, lots of humor. I'm just wondering how you kind of balanced, the story of some of these battles that you researched so well, but also and some of the fiction. How did you kind of put it together?
Well, I think I was much better at the research on the battles, because still basically I'm a reporter. It was hard for me to try to learn how to write fiction. Some of the romance, a couple of the sex scenes, I was told by a guy I was dating at the time who had actually covered Vietnam, had done a few tours of Vietnam for Argosy, the old men's magazine that doesn't exist anymore. And he was like, you can't write, and he had already had written quite a bit of fiction, and he's like, you can't get away with this, with no sex scenes at all. So, and I hear Lori, a friend from my writers group, who has recently published a novel called Unmentionables, and she was forced by the writers group into putting some sex scenes in her fiction.
Right. We're going to get to questions in just a moment. We have Pat back there. She'll have a mic, and she'll just raise your hand, and Pat will get to you if you have any questions for Tuohy. I want to ask you about sort of your own memories of the Vietnam War. You did touch on that a bit, but answer the question that's put in our exhibit. You know, did the press lose the war? What's your opinion of the press coverage of Vietnam War? Maybe you learned some things from researching this book.
Well, the first real bit of research I started out on was a book by Peter Braistip that was about that thick, that was done as a grant. And apparently he set out to basically try to prove that the press did lose the war. One of the contentions he had, and this of course was absolutely true, and I mention it in the book, that the fact that it was the embassy that was taken over, that a lot of other things were going on in Saigon during the Tet Offensive, but the reporters did pretty much all collect at the embassy, the image of the American embassy being taken over, and in point of fact, you know, as soon as the Marines landed, they got rid of this guys, the Viet Cong that had come in to take it over, and so it was absolutely true. The press was obsessed with the idea of the embassy. So that Tet Offensive was kind of a turning point. Did the press lose the war? I suppose if the press hadn't been reporting what was going on, maybe we'd still be there with troops. I don't know. I mean, yes, the press seemed to have, Walter Cronkite, I mean, in 1968, and I think it was February, finally said, and that's in your exhibit. But, so, I don't know. I mean, from my personal viewpoint, they were trying to report what was going on. Right. And the government was trying to deny what was going on. I mean, right. Going back to late 1961, an American flat top arrived down the Saigon River loaded with helicopters, and several reporters reported this, and the government denied it. The government said we're not. They weren't troops, they were advisors, they just, so it was a constant battle between the press and what the government was saying. So I wouldn't use the word lose, I would use the word, they were trying to report what they were seeing. Right. And they were running into obstacles all along the line. At the 5 o'clock Follies and every place else.
If we have any questions, we actually have in the audience, I won't embarrass him, but Don North, who is a reporter who covered the Vietnam War and for ABC. And Don, do you want to weigh in on that? What do you want to? I don't want to put you on the spot there, but
don't put me on the spot either, Don.
Yeah. Don was also a contributor to our exhibit, and
well, first observation I could make is that, it wasn't our war to lose. It wasn't. We told it like it was, and the facts spoke for themselves. Right. After almost 10 years, the American public got pretty tired of hearing about the war and being duped and virtually lied to by our government. Right. And when the Tet Offensive took place, they had built up a great public affairs scene with sending General Washington here to the National Press Club and Congress to tell everybody there was light at the end of the tunnel. The president was very positive. And then all of a sudden, on January 31st, bingo, the Vietnamese communists overran almost every major base in Vietnam, proving that it had all been a fantasy. And that just destroyed completely the morale, and before long we had the captain jump overboard the ship.
Right. Great. Thank you, Don. I didn't mean to put you on the spot there, but Oh, so I wanted to ask you about some of these great scenes when, and maybe Don was at some of these things, the bar scenes at the hotel, the Caravel and the
The
Continental.
Caravel rooftop and the Continental Bar.
Yeah, you almost feel like you're sitting there with these guys having some scotch. Tell us how you kind of got those scenes into the book where you.
Well, I've sat at a lot of bars drinking scotch, number one.
Yeah.
And my sources were reporters. I mean, I
Right.
read every single solitary book I could get.
I was
And
gonna-
they
yeah.
all talked about, they all talked about the Caravel and the Continental Shelf, as they called it.
Right.
And I eventually did go to Vietnam
You did.
to make sure I had absolutely everything right and to pick up, a few little details.
Right.
Angela was injured, and I got a guide to take me on a motor scooter to look at the hospital that I knew she was in, and I was blown away when I saw the inside of the hospital. The inside of the hospital grounds. I could have never imagined that, and no reporter ever reported on what the inside of the hospital grounds looked like. That it was sort of like a Holiday Inn with balconies all around and a cooking sort of outdoor barbecue pit, and there was laundry hanging up on, and I'm like, what's that laundry doing hanging up there? And the guy's like, well, the family has to come and wash their clothes, and the family's down there cooking their food. So a lot of stuff like that.
Right.
I found out.
Yeah, good stuff.
And when we first pulled into, I went on a tour all over the whole country, and when we first pulled into Saigon, the tour guide said, and this is the Opera House. And I'm like, I jumped up out of my chair and I said, that's not the Opera House, that's the National Assembly building. And he started laughing and he said, well, you may be right.
Right.
That may be what it was in 1968, but I'm too young to remember.
Yeah, right. Do you have a question, Pat?
I'll ask a question.
Yeah.
I don't want to make any presumptions about your age or anything like that, but where were you in your own career at the time that you were trying to cover in this book? And what were your impressions of what was going on at the time? And if you were way too young for that at the time, what were your impressions of it once you became aware of what was going on in Vietnam? As a reporter, as an American?
The first story that I ever did that touched on Vietnam, I was working for the Yonkers Herald-Statesman, and I was a totally green reporter, and I was sent out to cover I swear, I'm not even sure. I think it was the first guy from Yonkers that was killed in Vietnam. Anyway, I was sent out to cover. So I guess, that was like sort of early on, and people were kind of, how are we going to deal with this and what? So I was sent out to cover the funeral of this kid from Yonkers. He was a lieutenant, I think. And I got back, there's a funny story partly attached to that. I got lost trying to find the cemetery, but when I got back to my desk, I couldn't read any of my notes because I'd cried so hard during the funeral.
All right. We have a question.
So I guess that was
that's
I guess that was my sort of introduction to the whole thing.
Theasa, my question has to do a little bit more with the writing, and I know you struggled, like you said, going from a journalist background and learning fiction. So I guess what was the most difficult part of that for you? What is that's different? Fiction is different from journalism.
It was endless. I mean, that book was turned down, I think, I don't know how many times, and the editors that were turning it down or were saying, I can't put this down because it's so vivid, you can smell the streets, you can feel the heat, but the story doesn't work for me. And I had no idea what that meant. The story didn't, how can you say it's good writing and it's vivid and the story doesn't work? And it was finally that I got into a workshop that Lori was in with Kaylee Jones, whose father wrote the definitive World War II book. What was it? Huh?
From Here to Eternity.
From Here to Eternity. Anyway, she finally got me on track. We never really changed the structure, because what I would do, I'd read Michael Hare, or I'd read this person, or read somebody, and then I'd go, oh, good, I'm going to put Angela in that battle. So I wrote, I think, a whole bunch of very vivid newspaper stories about the battle. And I didn't understand the old advice from Chekhov. If you got a scene with if you got a gun over the mantelpiece in the first scene, you got to get back to that gun. And that was the part that I didn't understand, that sort of threading things of the characters from, and I also didn't understand point of view at all. That bar scene where Angela first meets Curtis, and she's sitting in the caravel and all these guys are trying to hit on her, and they're all talking about whether the Red Sox are going to win the World Series, was initially written from Curtis's point of view. And Kaylee said, that's got to be from Angela's point of view. And I'm like, I mean, I didn't understand any of that stuff.
Right.
So that's what took so long, was trying to, fiction and journalism are really different. And finally I began to understand it in my own mind. I mean, what I made up for myself was that journalism is linear and fiction is circular. And finally, I began to grasp that concept that things that happened here had to come up later. There had to be a thread. There had to be a... Anyway, there's
question.
a long-winded answer.
We have time for just a couple more questions, and if not from the audience, I can ask them. I just want to tell the audience what you hope people walk away after reading this book. What do you hope they get out of it?
It's true. The book is true. I mean, that's the book initially was called, one of the many different titles I had was How the Weather Was, which came from Hemingway. And he talked about that real fiction is true and people need to come away with people and places and how the weather was. And I went to a workshop at Swanee one time. Tim O'Brien was there, and we all had pink T-shirts with something with a little thing on the back that supposedly Tim O'Brien had said, although then he claimed while he was there that he hadn't said it. But he said, just because it didn't happen doesn't mean it isn't true. And that is precisely, I mean, my book is true.
Good.
It really is, even though I wasn't a correspondent during the Vietnam War, and even though, with the exception of Tim Page, who's a totally real character, you know, I made up the people, but it was true.
Right. Final question, just what's your next project? What are you working on right now?
Well, there's two answers to that. I finished a book about a woman stunt pilot and a tabloid journalist set in 1929. And my mother was an early day flyer, not a stunt pilot, but anyway, there's me and Mom.
Okay.
The tabloid. I wasn't a tabloid journalist,
Okay.
but I might have loved
Right,
being one.
right,
So that one's called Jenny Flynn, and we hope that might be coming out in the next year or so.
Okay. Excellent. Excellent.
And I'm writing a Paris mystery set in Paris now.
Okay. Excellent. Well, this is a great read. Again, it's called The 5 O'Clock Follies. What's a Woman Doing Here Anyway? Great title. Theasa, Tuohy, thank you for joining us on Inside Media.
Thank
and
you.
thank you all for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you, Don North, also, for being here.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, everybody. I love it when people are interested in my subject.
Yeah, and if you're interested, we'll be right outside. You can purchase a copy of the book, and Theasa will also be signing copies of her book just right outside. Thank you so much.